Hello, dear friends. Today we have a very interesting and frank interview with a former German sister of mercy. She saw the horrible crimes of the soldiers of the Third Reich and their accomplices on the Eastern Front. Many thousands of victims in the Jewish communities, elderly people, women and children, were mercilessly exterminated by them. Most of these criminals, regrettably, did not face any punishment. Likewise, she brings up another interesting point. What you can observe from the recollections of German veterans or ordinary Germans is that most of them claim that they had no knowledge of the crimes that were committed. They say they were shocked by the truth about the Holocaust and other committed crimes. I have always considered this to be a lie, because in face-to-face conversations the information travels very fast. This former sister of mercy proves my thoughts. For that reason, I personally found this interview to be a real revelation. I thought it would be very interesting for you to learn about it as well. Well, now we will turn directly to the interview itself. Mrs. Schocking-Homeyer, after the war, most Germans denied that they had any knowledge of the Holocaust. Between 1941 and 1943, you were a member of the German Red Cross on the home front of the Eastern Front. When was it that you learned that Jews were being killed?
It was when I was already on the train, heading over there. It was October 1941. I and another sister were supposed to be in charge of a sanatorium for soldiers in Zvia, also known as Novorad-Volynski, a small town about 200 kilometers west of Kiev. In Brest-Litovsk, we were accompanied by two soldiers. I cannot recall if they were SS or ordinary soldiers. Suddenly, one of them told us that he was supposed to execute a woman in Brest. She begged to be spared from death because she had a disabled sister who had no one to take care of her anymore. He asked to bring the sister and executed both of them. We were appalled, but kept our mouths shut.
Did he make a boast about that?
I do not know.
The many thousands of people in the Jewish community in Zvia were exterminated before you arrived. When did you find out about this?
An elderly officer gave us an explanation the day we arrived, that there are no Jews here anymore. They are all dead and their houses are empty.
Did he take you aside?
No, he told it in the evening at the table. A bit later I wrote to my parents about it. The letter also stated that I was, according to my neighbors, screaming at night. But you cannot do that. There is no way you can do that. It is opposed to the international law.
How was the city looked like?
The houses where the Jews lived were looted, with scraps of Jewish writings lying on the floor in the dirt. People told us that if you searched, you could find some very beautiful menorahs. One of the officers even brought one of these menorahs home.
Did you witness any mass graves?
The commander of the engineer brigade once suggested to us to have a walk around the old fortress of Zvia, and he showed one place on the riverbank and said that 450 Jewish men, women, and children were buried there. I kept silent.
Do you have any idea how many people were murdered in Zvia altogether?
We were assisted in the sanatorium by local Ukrainian women, and they told us that there were 10,000 people murdered. There were a lot of victims anyway. We came to realize this when a few weeks after we arrived, a huge clothing warehouse of the National Socialist People's Welfare (NSB) opened in Zvia. Since the wardrobe of our Ukrainian helpers was not rich, one officer asked me whether they would like to get something from the warehouse, and then I came there with them. Among other things, there were a lot of children's clothing there. Some of the girls refused to take anything. Other girls accepted something and gave their thanks. Heil Hitler. I wrote to my mother, and she immediately informed her sisters in Hamburg that they should not take any clothes under any circumstances from the NSB warehouses, because these were the clothes of murdered Jews.
Have you ever witnessed any crimes personally?
No, although it almost happened one day. I used to get groceries and beer for the sanatorium every week in Rivne, 100 kilometers from Zvia. There was a big ghetto in Rivne. Then one day, in July 1942, the beer house in which many Jews used to work was closed. We drove to the ghetto. It was empty. It was obvious that it had become empty only recently. We witnessed the men in German uniforms forcing the women and children, who must have been hiding somewhere, to gather in a crowd. I guess they were executed later. I started crying and drove back to Zvia, regretting that I could not return home right now.
And Rivni, they were killing people by the thousands in several stages. Do you have any details about this?
I used to go to the army headquarters in Rivne to get some cards. The soldiers were telling stories about the resettlements in such a calm manner. Of course, I was curious about these resettlements.
And you find out that it was sort of a euphemism to hide the murders of the Jews.
Yes, but I do not remember exactly when and in what way I realized that. At the headquarters, it was explained to me this way. In the evening, we are informed that there will be a resettlement in such and such area the next day, therefore there might be a noise. But this is beyond our business. We should not interfere. Nowadays we know that the executions were carried out by the Einsatzgruppen and the police.
Did they also come into your sanatorium?
I do not know about that. They wore regular uniforms and behaved as ordinary soldiers.
On November 5th, 1941, you wrote to your parents. Dad had a point in saying that people without moral principles have a special odor from them. I can recognize such people now. From many of them, I can smell blood. This whole world of ours has turned into a huge slaughterhouse. Did you feel like you were able to recognize murderers?
Yes, I felt that way. When a person is in charge of the life and death of other people, he moves and acts differently than others. He demonstrates that everything is in his hands.
Did you avoid such persons?
I was able to choose with whom to communicate.
Again and again in your letters, there are passages such as, "But the Jews that own most of the local shops are all dead," or, "There are no Jews around here in Zvia anymore." You do not mention anything about the murders. Did you have any fear of the censorship?
Of course. I was a fearful young woman. I wrote to my mother, I'm not her type, that she would not have made it through a single day here. I'm sure that she would have found a way to get out of there immediately. After all, anyone who stayed there was supporting the system. But I had no idea what sort of excuse I could find. In order to return to Germany, I had to get a permit.
Do you think your family understood what you were hinting at?
They did, of course.
Did you talk about the murders of Jews with the other sisters?
No.
But everyone knew what was going on.
It is difficult for me to say if the soldiers at the front also knew, but all those who were in the rear, in particular those who stayed longer in the rear, they knew.
How can you be so confident about that?
Because it has always been assumed in conversations that each of us knew. I have not yet mentioned the story of how I was once accompanied by a Feldwebel. I guessed he was from Munster, whose name was Frank, and he was telling me that he was going to join a large execution in a couple of weeks because he wanted to get a promotion. I warned him not to even think about it because then he would not sleep.
And what was the next thing that happened?
He did not hear me, and afterward he really started complaining that he felt wronged. I warned you. I told him that.
Why did he make the decision to trust you?
The conversations with the soldiers frequently became private. The men, who had been living without female companionship for a long time, were in need of talking, but Ukrainian women did not speak German. One day I was riding in a truck, and without any introduction, the driver began to tell me about how in Koziatin several hundreds of Jews had been forced to starve to death for 2 days before being executed because the firing squad was engaged elsewhere.
Did he talk to you in private?
Yes. There was another German farmer who had considerable influence in Zvia, Mr. Nagel from Hesse, and it was often told a story such as this. A convoy of Jews was being led near his house. His housekeeper, a Jewess, supposedly started laughing when she saw this. So he threw her out of the house and forced her to join the column. I realized the fact that I was surrounded by criminals very quickly.
You wrote to your mother, "I will soon cope with my inner opposition and will be able to tolerate everything much more easily." Even the most decent people in here have already gotten to that stage. If you cannot see all this, and mostly everything is over, you can try to let it go. For now, however, I nearly go mad seeing a child and realizing that in 2 or 3 days he will be dead. It sounds like you were trying to find a way to somehow accept the horrors around you.
That is something I do not remember very well. Perhaps I only wrote it to cheat the censorship.
There are some paragraphs in your letters according to which you yourself got under the influence of the environment.
No, my father was a lawyer, but in 1933 he was forbidden to practice his profession. I felt very afraid of the censors. I have never been anti-Semitic. We helped Jews during the war.
Did you ever talk after the war about what used to happen in Zvia hell?
I expected that the soldiers themselves would not be silent. I was mistaken, however. Back in 1945, I suggested to the prosecutor in Munster, under whom I had an internship 2 years earlier and who was by then the head of the prosecutor's office there, to make a case in order to start gathering the evidences. Because at that time all the facts were in their hands, what units and when they were stationed in Zvia hell. What he said was, let the British handle it. He was probably just too cowardly. After 3 or 4 years, I visited the Jewish community in Dortmund, where I was living at the time, but even there no one took an interest in Zvia hell.
But what about later?
In the justice authorities at that time, it was impossible to have an open conversation with colleagues who had also been in the East. The old Nazis were still in power everywhere. Only several years before I retired, the subject of Zvia hell arose again. I was a judge for Social Security issues, and I received in 1974 the documents of a Volksdeutsch who was trying to include in his pension qualifying period the service in the German police in Zvia hell in 1941. He was a member of the so-called Ukrainian Schutzmannschaft at that time, and I assumed participated in those so-called resettlements. I wrote to him to say that I knew what was happening in October 1941 in Zvia hell and that he should apply for a withdrawal of my candidature due to bias. He did so, and my colleague included his police service in his pension qualifying period. Regrettably, the law came down on his side.
Have you not sued this man?
He was only a tiny cog, but I submitted an inquiry to Ludwigsburg regarding the events in Zvia hell, and I gave testimony. The only person I could testify against directly was Feldwebel Frank. They couldn't find him.
That is all for today. Honestly, this interview is quite thought-provoking. What are your thoughts on the matter? Do you believe that most Germans did not know about the horrible crimes committed during the Second World War? Goodbye to you all. See you again.